Your body has been doing this for longer than writing has existed, longer than agriculture, longer than the wheel. And yet somehow, when you open a history book, this particular thread of the human story is almost never there. Think about that for a second. You can find entire museum wings dedicated to bronze swords nobody has swung in 3,000 years. You can watch a documentary reconstruct, frame by frame, how a Roman legion marched. But the one biological event that roughly half of every generation of humans has experienced, on a monthly basis, since before humans were even fully human, that gets a footnote if it gets anything at all. So here's a question worth sitting with. If something happens to billions of people generation after generation, and almost nobody writes it down, what does that silence tell you? It means someone decided it didn't matter enough to record. That decision, more than any biological fact, is the real subject of this video. The story starts earlier than you'd think. Long before Egypt, long before writing itself, there's a Neolithic settlement in what is now Turkey called Çatalhöyük, occupied roughly 9,000 years ago. Archaeologists digging there have found small clay and stone figurines stained with red ochre, along with burial goods marked the same way. Nobody can prove exactly what that red pigment meant to the people who used it. But several researchers studying the site have proposed that the staining deliberately echoes blood, and that these early communities may have been symbolically processing menstruation and fertility thousands of years before anyone picked up a stylus. If that theory holds, then the human urge to make meaning out of this bodily rhythm isn't a product of any one civilization. It's older than civilization itself. By the time you reach ancient Egypt, the picture sharpens considerably. The Ebers Papyrus, a medical text dating to around 1550 BCE, casually references gynecological conditions the way a modern manual might reference the flu. Not as a taboo, just as a fact of the body worth documenting. And the physical evidence lines up. Historians believe Egyptian women used softened, pounded papyrus and possibly rolled linen as absorbent material, both of which were already everywhere in daily Egyptian life. Nothing exotic, just the same fibers used for clothing and scrolls, repurposed for the body. What's striking isn't the material, though, it's the meaning attached to it. Egyptians tied menstruation conceptually to the Nile's own flooding cycle, and by extension to the goddess Isis, and the rhythms that sustained the entire civilization. A body that bled on a cycle wasn't broken. It was echoing the river that fed the empire. Women weren't secluded. They weren't treated as contaminated. Life continued, which, as you're about to see, was not the norm everywhere else. Now travel a few hundred miles northwest, and the story takes a sharp turn. Ancient Greece gave the world democracy, geometry, and some of history's most confident wrong answers about the human body. Aristotle, a man whose ideas shaped Western science for close to 2,000 years, proposed that menstrual blood was essentially failed semen, the residue of a process that would have produced male seed if only the female body weren't, in his view, a colder and weaker version of the male one. Sit with that. One of history's most celebrated thinkers looked at half the human population and concluded their bodies were just malfunctioning versions of the other half. But here's the contradiction that makes Greece genuinely strange. At the very same time Aristotle was writing this, Hippocratic physicians were treating menstruation as a completely ordinary vital sign. Something to track, something whose absence signaled a real medical problem worth solving. Two entirely different intellectual traditions, operating in the same culture, arriving at wildly different conclusions. Meanwhile, actual Greek women were using wool, an abundant resource in a wool-producing economy, fashioned into pads or small internal plugs. Arguably some of the earliest tampons in the historical record, alongside belts and fabric designed to hold the material in place. Rome takes the confusion to an almost comedic extreme. Pliny the Elder, in his sprawling 37-volume encyclopedia, claimed that a menstruating woman could sour wine by touching it, blunt the edge of a sword, kill bees, rust iron, and even repel hailstorms with her presence alone. Read that list again. It sounds less like natural history and more like a horror movie pitch. And yet, this wasn't fringe thinking. It was published as established knowledge from one of Rome's most respected scholars. Real Roman women, unsurprisingly, were not out there single-handedly destroying crops. They used wool, soft cloth, and sea sponges, a material the Mediterranean had in abundance, naturally absorbent and reusable after washing. And, predictably, wealth determined comfort. Women with money had access to fine linen and household help to manage laundering. Poorer women made do with whatever rough cloth was on hand. That gap between rich and poor experience shows up in nearly every civilization this video touches, and it never fully closes. Here's the deeper pattern worth pulling out. Across a huge range of ancient societies, the deciding factor was never really the material available. Wool, linen, cloth, sponges. These existed almost everywhere. What actually shaped a woman's life was whether her culture decided menstruation was dangerous or sacred. In Jewish law, a menstruating woman was considered ritually impure, or nida, restricted from touch and required to undergo purification before resuming normal contact. Hindu legal texts warned that a man who had sex with a menstruating woman would lose his strength and wisdom. Zoroastrian practice isolated menstruating women away from fire, water, and earth, the sacred elements themselves. And across many indigenous cultures in the Americas, women retreated to dedicated moon lodges, a practice that, depending on the tradition, was framed either as protective isolation or as honoring a woman's heightened spiritual power during that time. Same biological event, completely different verdicts on what it meant to be a woman living through it. Push forward into medieval Europe, and the picture gets messier, not more advanced. For most women who weren't wealthy, peasants, laborers, townswomen doing physical work all day, free bleeding was likely the reality. Thick wool skirts, layered undergarments, and dark fabric did the job of absorbing and concealing flow because stopping daily labor simply wasn't an option available to most people. Women with more resources used folded linen or wool, held in place with a belt, washed and reused, functionally not far off from what women across huge parts of the world still use today. The medical theory behind all this borrowed heavily from Greek and Roman ideas, filtered through the church. Physicians of the period, working from inherited Galenic theory, believed menstruation was the body purging excess blood, a kind of built-in cleansing mechanism. Stop that process, and illness would follow. So, somewhat surprisingly, medieval doctors actively encouraged menstruation rather than suppressing it, prescribing herbs and exercises when a period was late. But medicine wasn't the only force shaping how menstruating women were treated. Christian theology added its own layer, rooted in the idea that Eve's transgression in Eden had permanently marked womanhood with suffering, a framework historians sometimes call the Curse of Eve. Some medieval church-affiliated hospitals and religious communities use this doctrine to justify barring menstruating women from handling communion items or entering certain sacred spaces, treating the body's ordinary cycle as a lingering mark of original sin rather than a biological fact. It's a different flavor of restriction than Leviticus or Zoroastrian isolation, but it comes from the same underlying instinct, turning a bodily process into a moral verdict. Travel east during this same broad era, and traditional Chinese medicine tells an almost entirely different story. Rather than treating the female body as an inferior or malfunctioning version of the male one, Chinese medical texts dating back to the Han Dynasty treated menstruation as a diagnostic window into a person's overall health. Its timing, color, and consistency read as signals of balance or imbalance in the body's qi and blood. Women used cloth pads made from silk or cotton depending on social class, held in place with woven belts, and by the Tang Dynasty, garments had begun incorporating built-in fabric pouches for absorbent material, essentially early ancestors of the modern reusable pad. This wasn't folk superstition. It was a documented, refined medical tradition, passed down through generations of practitioners. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Aztec cosmology treated cycles agricultural, astronomical, and bodily, as fundamentally interconnected, which meant menstruation carried real ritual significance rather than shame. Aztec women appear to have used fibers from the maguey plant, the same versatile plant behind food, rope, and alcohol production throughout Mesoamerica, as absorbent material. And across many North American indigenous traditions, the Moon Lodge wasn't a punishment at all. Women followed specific customs, particular foods, particular herbs, particular rituals. And in many of these traditions, a woman was considered to be at her most spiritually powerful during this time, returning from isolation with elevated, not diminished status. Here's the fact that tends to genuinely stop people mid-scroll. The disposable pad you might be picturing right now, that specific product, is barely a century old. The first commercial version, Lister's Towels, launched around 1888. It flopped almost immediately, largely because Victorian-era women were too embarrassed to ask a male pharmacist for one over the counter. It wasn't until 1921, when Kotex reframed the product through advertising as a hygiene essential rather than a shameful item, that mass adoption actually began. But recent history isn't a clean, upward story of progress either. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, a wave of toxic shock syndrome cases in the United States was traced directly to a specific generation of extra-high absorbency synthetic tampons, which created conditions that allowed a common bacterium to release dangerous toxins into the bloodstream. Hundreds of women were hospitalized, and dozens died before manufacturers reformulated products, and regulators mandated warning labels. It's a sobering detail because it proves this isn't some solved problem, safely tucked away in the ancient past. Even in the modern era, with full access to industrial manufacturing and clinical science, this part of women's health has been treated as an afterthought right up until people got hurt. So pull back and look at the whole shape of this story. From red-stained figurines at Çatalhöyük, to papyrus in Egypt, to wool in Greece, to sea sponges in Rome, to silk pouches in Tang Dynasty China, to maguey fiber in Aztec territory. The materials were never really the obstacle. What varied wildly from civilization to civilization was the story each culture told itself about what that blood meant. Sacred, tied to the Nile's flooding. Evidence of inferiority, according to Aristotle. An environmental hazard, according to Pliny. A mark of original sin, according to certain medieval clergy. A sign of spiritual power, according to many indigenous traditions. Same biology, radically different verdicts, and notice something else. Almost none of this was written by the women living it. Pliny's list of crop-destroying nonsense tells you what Roman men feared, not what Roman women actually experienced. The real knowledge, what worked, which herbs eased cramping, how to fold cloth so it held through a day of labor, lived inside communities of women and passed mouth to mouth, almost never making it onto a page that survived. That's the real loss here. Not that history ignored a footnote. It ignored a universal human experience that shaped how half the population was allowed to move through the world, in every civilization, on every continent, for the entire span of recorded history and long before it. Next time this subject gets treated as too awkward to bring up, it's worth remembering that Cleopatra dealt with this. Roman farm women dealt with this. Tang Dynasty court women dealt with this. Aztec priestesses dealt with this. It isn't a modern controversy. It's some of the oldest, most consistent history human beings have ever lived through. And it's long overdue for a place in the story we actually tell.